Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for this great session with Eytan Buchman, the Chief Marketing Officer of Freightos, one of the most coolest companies out there in the log tech. My name is Nir Gartzman from the DOC. We are early stage investors in startups targeting the maritime ports and logistics sector. And I have the honor to present Eytan. So Eytan, please go ahead and thanks in advance for this insightful session.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Nir, and thanks to the entire Exchange team. This is really exciting. I miss conferences a little bit. There's some parts that I miss, and some parts that I miss a little bit less. But yeah, I'm excited to jump in here. So I was asked to speak a little bit about this idea of if you build it, they will click or might click. And if you kind of know Freightos and kind of what we've been doing over the past couple of years, we run this annual survey where we try to figure out how well are international freight companies selling their freight services online. And that's what I was supposed to talk about. But I'm going to go a little bit off script just because I like to not follow directions. And I want to start off by looking at a modem. Right? Modems are probably one of the most boring things that are out there, even though they actually would have changed the world. Right? We know that this webinar is only taking place because of a modem and because of routers that hit the wireless routers, blah, 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 blah. And even though modems are the fundamental piece of technology that move the bits and bytes around the world, when people talk about technology, they very rarely talk about modems and routers. Right? What they actually talk about is the big five, the FANG plus Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google, Amazon, the real tech companies that when you look at tech, you think, oh, these are the companies that are changing the world. Right? And I think there's a really interesting insight there that maybe 30 or 40 years ago, the revolution was, how do I move these bits and bytes around the world? Today, the revolution is, how do I take the bits and bytes that are already moving around the world and turn them into insights and turn them into new ideas? And obviously, the very, very clear analogy here is in freight, we all move things around the world. Right? We all move boxes. Containers have not changed in 40, 50 years, with the exception of some small tracking and IoT shifts. I don't see them changing hugely, and maybe Nir will disagree with me afterwards. I don't see them changing hugely in the next 20 or 30 years. I think the real question that everybody right now in the logistics industry, and especially in containerized freight, now has to deal with is how do we do better things with the same bits and bytes? So not to keep everybody in suspense, I'll start with a little bit of a spoiler alert here. Where I'm going to go with this is that we are all data companies. There is no company that is on this call that is not a data company. The other thing is that we are all customer service companies. Right? We all have customers. Sometimes those are internal customers, your own internal employees, and sometimes they're external customers, but we're all customer-facing organizations. And the third thing is that not only are we customer-facing organizations, and not only are we data organizations, but it's on us to find better ways to create better experiences with the exact same data. And if you have to log out right now, I just want you to walk away with that one idea. So what we're going to talk about today in the next 20 or 22 minutes, or until they drag me off the screen, is starting off with fidget spinners. Those stupid little toys that people play around with, and how I think that was a very fundamental shift in how supply chains work. We're going to move on to talking about where logistics is today from a digital freight sales perspective. We're going to shift from there to what I believe has really changed when it comes to internal capabilities, the technology capabilities that are creating new opportunities for logistics companies. And then we'll continue from there to how the world has changed, the external drivers that have nothing to do with logistics, but have massive impacts on how we as organizations work. And finally, I'm going to end with putting those pieces back together and trying to figure out how we can take the internal changes and the external changes and combine them into something that makes for better digital experiences with our customers. Of course, if you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please feel free to drop them into the chat. We'll try to make this as interactive as possible and try to replicate the DSC experience. So as Nir started off by saying, my name is Eytan Buchman. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at the Freightos Group. That's me on the right. That's exactly the kind of kid that you think will grow up to market freight. And my job is to try to make freight look sexy, whether it's to investors, to large customers, small customers, or freight companies. I also talk a little fast, so sorry about that. A lot to squeeze in 22 minutes. Now, a lot of people kind of wonder, what the heck does Freightos actually do? I think that's a really good question. And not to kind of give ourselves an advertisement, I actually want to bring this up for a specific reason. Right? What Freightos actually does is we provide software as a service to freight forwarders to help them digitize their pricing. Using that technology, we also enable them to sell freight services online via freightos.com to over 300,000 importers around the world. We also work with Alibaba.com on that. So it's basically the world's largest marketplace to instantly compare, book, and manage shipments. And then on the web cargo side, beyond the software for forwarders, we connect the freight forwarders with airlines, predominantly, and some ocean liners, in order to instantly compare prices and book available capacity in real time. And the reason I bring this up is that we have a lot of different customers, right? We work with small businesses, large businesses, freight forwarders, ocean liners, airliners, enterprise organizations that are in the top 10 global importers and much smaller companies. And across the entire board, we generate data and we have a lot of customers. And for us, a big job is how do we put all these pieces together to create better experiences? So moving on from there, let's talk about fidget spinners for a second, right? You probably picked one of these up and played with it 5 or maybe 3 or 4 years ago. For me, the penny really dropped on how supply chains are changing with fidget spinners. Because I was thinking about creating some fidget spinners as Freightos swag for trade shows back when those actually existed. And I looked online very, very quickly. And I saw that Alibaba had hundreds and thousands of listings for fidget spinners. And I went onto Amazon, and I saw that Amazon had a ton of fidget spinners as well. And this was in the very early days of the fidget spinner craze. Everybody suddenly had them. They were everywhere. Small bodegas, little grocery stores had fidget spinners. They were on Amazon, as I said. They were on e-commerce websites. And I went to the Toys R Us website, and they weren't there yet. And that was a really interesting shift. It used to be that the really large companies, the monsters, the Toys R Us's, could leverage their scale and leverage their team in order to move faster. The entire supply chain shifted to smaller businesses or larger businesses that were better at leveraging digital capabilities to move things around the world much faster. I think this is exactly what I was talking about before with modems, which is that suddenly a small company or large company that can move data around better, that knows how to go online and source things and ship things, that knows how to sell things online, that knows how to manage their customers online with data-driven processes, can outmaneuver a huge beast like Toys R Us. And we all know how that story ends with small buyers joining Amazon, sellers joining Amazon every single day to sell freight services, and Toys R Us declaring bankruptcy just 2 years ago. So I think this is a really, really big shift. Now, just 2 or 3 days ago, I did a webinar with a gentleman from Air France KLM, the head of customer service and distribution. And we were talking about digital freight sales. And somebody on the call asked a question and basically said, hey, everybody makes this comparison of passenger seat sales versus freight sales. We do it as well. But it's a wrong comparison, right? Passenger sales, it's one unit, it's easy to do, you can sell to anybody. Freight is complicated. And yes, freight is complicated, but it's not complicated enough that it's not going to go digital. I promise right now that within the next 10 years, over half of global freight will be online, and I'm willing to put money down on that. And our investors are certainly willing to put money down on that. Because it's already happening in B2B, right? People are already going online, not even in logistics, and putting money down to buy things. One of Amazon's fastest growing business units is Amazon Business. It's also happened in industries that are far more complex than freight, right? If finance is digitized and some of these largest startups in the world, like Stripe, are taking over the global economy, you know that it can also reach freight. And it's not just that it's happening in complex industries, it's happening in B2B freight. Maersk's online portal for booking freight is one of the top 10 global B2B e-commerce websites. Air France KLM told us that 43% of their bookings are digital, right? This industry is already moving online. And I've always, for years, I've talked, and I hope there's somebody from Kuehne+Nagel here, for years I've talked about how Kuehne+Nagel's website, their approach to digital freight sales was ahead of the time. They were able 5-6 years ago, when we started running this survey, they were able to start selling freight services online. And I admire them for that. I think they did a phenomenal job there. And this is what I was supposed to talk about. I was supposed to talk about if you build it, they will click. If you have a sales portal on your website as a freight forwarder, people will come online and they'll book it. And I've been giving that pitch for a long time, for 6 or 7 years. And I used to start off with this exact slide every single presentation where I would say, look, passenger travel has been digitized for decades, since the 1960s. In the 1970s, you could walk into a travel agent and you could get a ticket in real time, but below deck, it's just starting to digitize. But I don't need to do that, because by this point in the industry, digital freight sales is table stakes, right? Table stakes means that this is what you need to bring with you in order to show up at the table. It doesn't mean that everybody has it. No, not everybody has a sales portal or digital freight service management where their customers could log in. But more and more companies do have it, right? Maersk has an online sales portal. Hapag-Lloyd has one. Kuehne Nagel has one. More and more freight forwarders have it. And even if not every single player has it, every single player will have it. And some of these companies are doing it very well without Freightos. So this is not a Freightos advertisement. This is a statement of fact that this is where the industry is, right? So where is it today based on the survey that we did? And the context for this is that once a year, we create a fake company. We try to get freight quotes from the world's largest, the top 20 freight forwarders around the world. Recently, we expanded that to also include the top 5 ocean liners, as well as the newer digital freight forwarders, the Flexports and Freight Hubs, which turned into Forto of the world. So what did we find in this last survey that we ran just earlier at the end of 2019? So one of the important things we figured out is that when it comes to LCL, which I think is probably the most complex type of freight, right? A 40-foot container is a 40-foot container. But when it comes to less than a container load, most of the top freight forwarders in the world right now have a dedicated request for quote form. And this sounds like obviously they do, but it wasn't always the case, right? You can see that transition where in 2015, no companies were providing instant freight quotes, and that's shifted to 4 in 2019. And in 2020, which will release the survey results soon, that's gone up to 7 or 8. And that's without necessarily even having an account. As soon as you have an account, you can get instant quotes much faster from more than 10 of the top 20 freight forwarders. So we really are seeing this transition where more companies are selling freight services online. And I always see that as the tip of the iceberg, because you can only sell freight services online if your internal pricing and your internal sales are digitized as well, which means that this is just the manifestation of a certain level of internal digitization. We're also seeing that that leads to faster responses, whether it's instant or takes a little bit more time. So when we try to get those freight quotes, you can see that the ocean carriers, 3 out of the top freight ocean liners, can provide quoting in under 24 hours. The digital freight forwarders, shockingly, are not nearly as advanced when it comes to selling freight services to customers that just walk in off the street and onto their website. But more and more companies are moving towards faster responses. For me, I care less about those companies that took 72 or 96 hours, and I care more about the companies that refuse to quote to a small business that's trying to import, right? Either they never get around to it, or they decide that it's not worthwhile their time. And that is a crazy thought. When your incremental costs to sell are 0, you try to sell to everybody, right? But if every single time somebody at your office is working on a price quote, of course you're going to miss out on business, because there's some that off the bat, up front, you say, I'm not going to sell to them. Finally, because not everybody is digitized yet, there is lacking transparency. There's a large range of prices. So when we ran this experiment and we got price quotes for this LCL shipment from a lot of different companies, there's an 192% range of pricing just for that one shipment, an identical shipment from Shenzhen to Pennsylvania. There's very few industries where you will still go to the top 20 companies and get that wide of a range. In other words, this is happening. It's not done, right? We're still in the relatively early days. There are companies that do this and see return on investment, and again, not on Freightos. Even if they do it themselves or with a different platform, there's companies that are getting serious return on investment. And the bad news is that your first mover edge is now over, right? The companies that are doing it today and that launched this new platform cannot say that they are the most innovative companies. This is rapidly becoming the table stakes generation of digital freight sales. So having it is not enough, right? It's not always roses. If you know the Field of Dreams, which is what the title of this presentation is really referencing, there's a very famous line there of, if you build it, they will come. And the truth is, if you build it, if you build your sales portal right now, they won't always click. There's a lot of companies that are out there that have built sales portals and are not happy with the way that it's working for them. And that's because you need to invest in it. In the early days of COVID, I went out and I bought myself, or I went online and I bought myself a treadmill. Just because I have that treadmill does not mean that I'm losing weight, right? You need to find something and then you need to invest in it day in and day out. Putting a website up is never enough. It's about understanding your customers and investing in it. One of the smartest things that I heard in this Air France KLM webinar from a couple of days ago is that in the beginning of the year, their digital freight sales were in the mid-20s. By the middle of COVID, it was up to 43% because their customer service representatives were not always as available. So customers went onto the website instead because they couldn't speak to the customer service reps. And suddenly they realized how easy it is. So they basically ended up investing in this platform more and pushing more customers there, and they liked it. But I think that, if I can pause for 1 second and just summarize, what I'm trying to say is that yes, digital freight sales is a reality. Yes, it's becoming something that almost every company in the world will have, if not now, then in the next 5 years. But it's not enough. You need to continue to invest in it. And more importantly, there's no longer this first mover edge of saying, I have this, I'm better than everybody else. So what is happening next, right? What is next up that's really going to change? What is the big thing beyond digital freight sales that freight companies really need to invest in order to beat the future and figure out what the next digital freight sales concept is? So I want to propose that there's 3 internal capabilities that apply to every single freight company that are actually changing global freight. The first is legibility, and I'll explain each one of these afterwards. The second is big data, and the third is functionality. Now let's unpack those 3, and I'll dive in a little bit deeper. Legibility is the idea that every single thing that was once offline is now parsable online. Autonomous cars can finally happen because you have radars that can read where pedestrians are and where there's streets. There's a company called Bottomless that sends you coffee grinds in a receptacle that has a scale inside of it. So they see that when your coffee beans are running out, they'll automatically send you new coffee before you run out of it. They're taking this thing that was offline, how much coffee you have left in your house, and bringing it online. They're making it legible. Now, the 2 ways that that's changing freight is RPA, robotic process automation, where every email you get and every phone call you get and every click that an internal employee makes can be parsed and brought online and digitized. And in the physical world, which is very important for freight, IoT is coming along, which means that you can not only track every digital thing that's happening and structure it, you can take everything that's happening offline and structure it, which means that you're suddenly collecting all of this data. And I see a lot of places where this is happening, but I think the most basic idea is customer support. I spoke to an airline that said that 90% of the calls that they get is, where's my freight? Why on earth should anybody today be making a phone call like that when everything is legible and a computer can figure out where your container is using IoT, parse that automatically into a back-end system, and when the customer sends an email that says, where are my goods, it automatically checks where it is, because suddenly the freight's location is legible. The second thing is big data. I recently did a webinar interview with somebody who runs supply chain innovation at Johnson & Johnson. And he said, listen, we have a ton of data at Johnson & Johnson, but it's not enough. We need to combine that with alternative sources, things like social media signals, the S&P 500, our own data sets and external data sets in order to come up with insights. So taking this idea of legibility, right? Suddenly you have all this data, figuring out how do you actually combine that in order to drive new ideas is something that is really, really revolutionary, I think. Right, so I think of one idea that's really cool when it comes to big data, and I've seen this, is what Uber Freight does on the trucking side, where instead of me actually figuring out what is the price for a truck, I let it figure it out automatically, the same way that Uber taxis can automatically price what goods are. Why is anybody sitting in the spreadsheet and saying, today my rate is X or Y, when you can automatically do that by combining demand trends with supply trends? And the third thing is functionality. You can parse all of that data. You can analyze that data. Now, how do you bring it forward and bring new meaning to it so customers can do something new? And bring Kuehne+Nagel, and again, if there's somebody from Kuehne+Nagel, please tell your team I love what they do. Kuehne+Nagel Pledge is this really cool offering that when you ship something, you get a guarantee it'll get there on time. And if it doesn't get there on time, you get insurance reimbursement for damages. And the only way they can do that is legibility, knowing where goods are, big data, being able to combine it all so you can build models that can support when goods are actually going to get where they get, and then making that forward-facing for the customer. Maersk Spot does the same thing where you can cancel shipments. You're giving new functionality to companies based on all the data that you've collected. I've seen other examples like this, integrated freight checkout. If you already have pricing and you already have the ability to integrate it with other companies, you can take those prices and shove it inside of a checkout, right? So if Amazon can let you ship with FedEx or used to let you ship with FedEx, Amazon Business one day might let a freight company integrate directly and automatically let companies ship containers around the world. So what does that mean if you take all three of those things? It means speed and scalability, right? You can take these big data sets and turn them into something very, very scalable. As a side project at Freightos, we ran a bunch of analysis on custom records, and we're able to create a customs classification engine that was relevant over 95% of the time. And that's speed and scalability. You get new agility, like the real-time pricing I talked about at Uber Trucking, and you have new ideas for integrations, like things that Chain.io are doing, where they're bringing new companies together, or what I mentioned before with Alibaba, where Freightos can integrate prices from freight forwarders directly into Alibaba checkout. So I like to look at those as the Mentos, right? Those are one component that you need to bring into the mix in order to really let things explode. The internal drivers with technology capabilities that we can now change. Now let's throw the external industry drivers in as well. And this is a little bit simpler because we're all consumers at the end of the day. And I think all three of these things will resonate, which is changing customer expectations, transparency, and values, right? So what do those actually look like? Customer experience is that nobody likes to wait for anything ever, and people like to feel like they're empowered. DB Schenker's website, when you compare quotes, lets you choose the sailing of your choice. Expeditors, famously an IT leader, bought Fleet, a digital trucking platform, to make their freight plug and play, right? So that customer experience that we all know from Netflix and Amazon is something that we're all expecting from our freight forwarders or from our carrier as well. The second thing is transparency, and this resonated with me a lot in a Journal of Commerce conference a couple of years ago, where the CEO of DB Schenker actually got up there and said, we need to recognize that transparency is a thing, right? If I can go online with a fake company and get freight quotes from 7 different companies, any company in the world can. And they can do it easier because they're larger businesses, which means that any customer can get prices from different freight companies. Anybody can get service levels or recommendations for services from different companies. And if they can get it anyways, why not give it to them directly? Going back to that same webinar we did with Johnson & Johnson, we asked him what he wants from providers, and he said, democratize the pricing. I don't care if I pay an extra 20 cents or 50 cents per kilo. If I have the right service that's given to me, don't focus on the secrecy, focus on the value. And speaking of values, the last really important component is the level of value and brand that you bring in. Customers want to be part of a movement, whether it's a brand they respect or values that they respect. And I think Flexport here was a lesson for the entire industry, where it's sexy enough that there's freight companies, and I know there's a lot of debate about the technology there, and I think they're doing amazing things with technology, but I really think that one of the biggest things they brought is a brand that people want to be part of. They really want to belong to it, and that's existed in freight before. Hapag-Lloyd's consistency, their orange, big orange, is a brand that people want to be associated with as well. So this has happened with other organizations as well, but what you really need to figure out is, how do I take that, if that's my Coca-Cola, and the Mentos is the external things that are happening, and mix them all together to make things explode? How do you understand what's happening within your industry and what's happening outside to really change the world? So what I would end with is that the question is not, how can I do X faster, smarter, or better? How can I sell faster or sell a little bit more, provide a little bit better customer service? The real question to ask is, how can I combine the new capabilities that I have with the expectations from my customers to do something impossible? I think Prime delivery, 2-day delivery, and later 2-hour delivery is a great example of that. The physical capabilities were always there. What actually changed? Broader infrastructure, more data, and the idea that we can make this happen. And this is just like Kuehne+Nagel Pledge or Maersk Flex, the idea that we can bring in multiple shipments from different carriers and let them all manage it in one place. So with that, I would just leave with 3 more guiding principles about thinking big and coming up with the next digital freight sales platform. Like, what else do you need to come up with? What do the customers actually want from you? What would you do if you didn't know the industry? If you were starting from scratch, if you had no clue of what their limitations were, how would you push out and start coming up with new ideas? And then how can you connect, mix, and match? The companies that are really changing the world right now are ones that recognize that they don't own everything and they can't do everything. And what they need to do is partner with other leaders, integrate using API capabilities to make things work better. And if you build that, I promise you that they'll click. That's it from my side. Back to you, Nir. Oh, I think you're muted, man. Wait, Nir, you're muted.
Thank you. It's truly insightful. Every time that I have the opportunity to hear you, I learn new stuff, new things about the industry and what's happening around. It sounds like you talk about big customers, Coca-Cola as a customer of the industry, DB Schenker or Kuehne+Nagel as a big player within the industry. How about mid-size companies compared to the enterprise companies? How you do recommend them to go online, to be more digital for their customers, actually to survive in the new digital freight world?
So I actually think that when it comes to smaller and mid-sized businesses and freight forwarders, I think this is a golden period, right? Because and this is exactly what I was saying with Toys R Us versus the people that are selling on Amazon. In a lot of ways, with the exception of I think probably BSAs and buying in bulk, scale is basically no longer the key factor that really lets you survive. So I look at the Freightos marketplace and I see that there are some small companies that are outselling some of the top 10 freight forwarders in the world that are also selling on the platform. And they do that because they're using the right internal capabilities, not necessarily our platforms, but using the right internal capabilities to digitize and scale. And if 10 years ago or 5 years ago, a freight forwarder would have to put out $150,000 or $1.5 million to build their own internal system, right now a freight forwarder can throw a rock and hit 5 or 6 different platforms that could help him digitize his customer service management or his freight pricing or his tracking and tracing. So suddenly the ability to shift your organization really quickly becomes a huge asset. And actually, it's kind of like a jujitsu thing where you turn your weakness of being small into a strength where you can move much faster. Like you can get your company onto a new platform much faster than a top 10, top 20, or top 100 freight company can. So I think that you need to recognize who are my customers and what's my value add. Just yesterday, Maersk talked about how they're merging the Damco and the Maersk brand and how they're really going to finalize that. What does that do for the industry when you have a giant Maersk that is the combination of Damco and Maersk and can suddenly provide direct ocean services to shippers, large and small? How do you beat that out? I think you need to beat it out with amazing customer service, all of that banking on very strong internal digitization.
Interesting. So thank you for that. I want to address a question from the audience, from Peter, who asked, how did the industry change since you started Freightos? I know that you've been there from the early days. And also, how the organization like you see the DCSA, the Digital Container Standard Association that recently launched?
The industry has changed amazingly. And I think it's been an equal amount of it changing and my perception of it changing. Because I think like a lot of startups, we went out screaming, freight is traditional, it's old school, it needs to change. And it's a little bit humbling, but the more you learn, the more you realize, wait, this isn't backwards. They're doing a ton of things. It's just really hard to shift a large ship over. I think the industry has changed in that they're much more open-minded. I think that it's become an idea that we can use technology. We can use off-the-shelf technology, or we can build it ourselves. But we can use that, and we can also think out of the box. When we first started, we were petrified of telling people that we are going to run a freight marketplace. Right? We started by saying we'll do freight pricing tools and freight rate management, and we were petrified that people would think that we're launching a marketplace because we knew the industry would be scared. And over time, before we even launched it, people would come to us and say, hey, this is a great product. I just had this idea. What if you guys launched a freight marketplace because you already work with a lot of customers on pricing? And I realized that the industry is now much more open to new business models. And I think the combination of that change, plus the fact that the world is changing and pushing new business models is changing things a lot. In terms of DCSA and IATA on the air side, I think standardization is a wonderful thing. Right? I think like just the webinar platform that we're using for this, BigMarker, I wouldn't be able to use it if we weren't using the standard of HTTP. Right? I need the URL structure in order to use this. And I think standardization will open up new opportunities. I think platforms are something that, in general, and we run 2 platforms, WebCargo for airlines and forwarders, and Freightos for forwarders and importers. And I think platforms are going to have a huge shift on the industry. Being able to build platforms easily is key from standardization. And I think that more players in the space doing the same thing, banking off of the advantages of standardization, will be a huge driver of change in the industry. And I'm excited to see it because it'll basically give companies, whether they're big, small, based in Southeast Asia or India or Bangkok or in Nebraska, will all be able to compete equally and basically compete to provide better customer service.
Okay, thank you for that. We ran out of time for any other questions, so thank you, Eytan. It is great, hopefully for the audience as well. And see you on the next conference, hopefully face-to-face.
Amen to that. Thanks very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much, Nir. Have a great one.
Thank you.